Thank you for joining us again for the Benefactors of Posterity, the founding era of the Filson Historical Society, 1884 to 1899. Now to introduce our speakers. Daniel Gifford is a public historian who focuses on American popular and visual culture, as well as museums in America culture. He received his PhD from George Mason University in 2011. He holds additional degrees from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Gifford's career spans both academia and public history, including several years at the Smithsonian Institution. He currently serves on the board of directors at the Filson. Thank you very much. And guest curated the 2022 exhibit, Ode England on the Ohio, Louisville Tudor Revival. In addition to the new work we are discussing tonight, previous books by Dr. Gifford have explored the commemoration of the whaling industry at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition and how holidays and holiday imagery express deep divides at the height of the progressive era. Dr. Patrick Lewis came to the Filson Historical Society in 2019. And since 2020, he has been the Director of Collections and Research and co-editor of the Ohio Valley Journal. Starting January 1st, I am pleased to announce he will be the President and CEO of the Filson. Before coming to the Filson, he worked at the National Park Service and the Kentucky Historical Society. Lewis is author of For Slavery and Union, Benjamin Buckner and the Kentucky Loyalties in the Civil War, University Press of Kentucky, 2015, and co-editor of Playing at War, Identity and Memory in Civil War Video Games, Louisiana State University Press, 2024. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Gifford and Dr. Patrick Lewis.
Well, sincere thanks to all of you for joining us. This is a year of celebration and commemoration of Filson's 140th anniversary. Thanks to Carol Butler for facilitating the publication of this book and being such a wonderful partner. A round of applause for her before we start. And a really well-deserved round of applause, and there'll be many tonight, to Dan Gifford. As Julie mentioned, Dan is a board member, and there have been lots of gifts to the Filson Historical Society, but this one of time and talent and all of the work that goes into the research and the writing of the book is one of the most generous things I can think of. So thank you. So we have this really incredible book, Benefactors of Posterity. How did this project come about? How did it start? What's the origin story?
I always like to say my short answer is you ask me. The real answer, the longer answer is last year as the anniversary was approaching and we were thinking about what we wanted this 140th anniversary to represent, we had conversations about the fact that even though we're a historical society, there's a lot about our own history that we didn't know, or we knew incompletely, or maybe we knew incorrectly in a couple of spots. And it was really an opportunity to look at that and think about what is it that we want to know. And interestingly enough, I think our initial conversations actually weren't even about a book. It was really about the first 10 founders, the 10 men that came together to create the Filson 140 years ago. And how did they know each other? And what were their connections? And how did this all come about? And it was in that process and the researching of that I think it became pretty evident that this was not only could grow, but should grow into a book-length project to get at that. But I think it was important to tackle some of these questions and some of these topics. I think it's very easy for any organization, and I don't, not just historical societies, but any organization, nonprofit, something in the humanities, something not, corporations, to not want to address history, especially if you know that it's not always going to be flattering, that it's not always going to be a rosy picture. It's very easy to say, well, that's not who we are now, so why not let sleeping dogs lie? Why stir up the past? Well, historians, we need to stir up the past, right? We can't hide from that. But I credit the Filson for coming along on that journey and never once flinching at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I would say there's equal parts of all of that, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about tonight. But so that's really, kind of all went into the origin.
I'm going to ask the question that normally, because I'm the person passing the mic for audience questions, when there's a lull, I ask because it interests me, and now I get to ask it first because I'm up here. What were the first steps for research? Where do you turn? Maybe tell us a little bit about that initial dossier building, and then where did you go next to start fleshing out these chapters?
So, as I said, it started by looking at these 10 individuals, these 10 men, and what connected them. So I was looking at a lot of census records, house records, and one thing that became very apparent early on, one name you're going to hear over and over again, in fact, he's the gentleman on the cover, Reuben Durrett. Reuben Durrett was one of the 10, but was really the founding force behind the Filson. He also happened to be, in an earlier incarnation of his life, a newspaper man. And he was a good publicist. And one of the things that he did early on, one of the things that turned out to be great for the Filson Club, if you hear us call it that occasionally, that was the original name of it, but also great as a researcher, is he got the Courier Journal involved. And every monthly meeting, there were nine a year, they took a summer break, almost without fail, something was reported in the Courier Journal, which is great because the Filson itself has a lot of the presentations and doesn't have a lot of presentations. A lot of them are missing. They're just gone to the ages. Some of them are misidentified. They're on the wrong weeks or the wrong months. And the Courier Journal piece really made it possible from the beginning to just go month by month, year by year for these 15 years and see every presentation that was given. And that's really where the surprises started to click. What these presentations were, who gave them, how they were delivered, the reactions, all of that was covered. That was a huge resource for me as a historian doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I was stunned. You made a spreadsheet with what we thought the date was, what we thought the topic was, does the Filson have a copy, and what do the notes from the CJ say? And I remember just sitting at my desk. I had a million other things to do that day, but I could not tear myself away from this calendar of what this organization had been doing. It was fascinating, the topics that we didn't know were covered, and we'll get into that in a minute. I want to roll back. Before presentation started, the Filson emerges from an ecosystem of some predecessor organizations. What were some of those organizations, and why did they not quite turn over?
So this is so the book is 10 chapters in all, and this question is chapter 1. How did the Filson survive for 140 years? Thank you very much. When a lot of organizations didn't. And in fact, one of the things I discovered looking at these 10 founders is they were involved in a lot of organizations that failed. There were Civil War history societies, both on the Confederate and the Federal Union side. Didn't go anywhere to speak of. There were pioneer history organizations. Didn't go anywhere. And then When the Southern Exposition comes along, we'll probably end up talking about the Southern Expo a couple times tonight. It weaves itself over and over. And given the fact that the St. James Art Fair was just this past weekend on the site of the Southern Expo, this is really important history to Louisville. This group of history-minded individuals tries to come up with a way of doing something at the Southern Expo. Version of that became another history organization that failed. But from the wreckage of that one, I would say, as well as all these other seeds, they came together again, and that's when the Filson was founded. But it took, I think, the experience of a lot of those trial and error, a lot of those failures, for this group of 10 individuals, these 10 men, to understand what it was going to take. And again, I want to really, give a lot of credit where credit's due with Reuben Durrett. He understood the need for being hands-on. He was extremely hands-on. This was his baby. This was his organization. And he really facilitated making this happen and having it gel. And I think as you read that, especially that first chapter, especially if you have, I think, any sort of background in public affairs and nonprofits and the humanities, even just good business sense, he was really savvy. He treated this organization smartly. He wasn't just, oh, we like to have history and talk about history. He was thinking about how to make it a success and really applied smart business decisions 140 years ago that I think are still paying off today.
Yeah. And I knew him. He's, Durrett is a ghost that sort of haunts the Filson, not literally. He was never in this building. Just stop. But his legacy looms so large in this organization, along with a couple other figures later in the 20th century. And so I knew him sort of professionally through that. I knew his public and political career, especially as a Civil War historian. That was very present in my knowledge of him. You uncover what ultimately is really a tragic personal history that in some ways motivates this dedication.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that there are certain pieces of the Filson story that were there to see that I think probably were known at the time, probably were known to other researchers, but weren't talked about. And this is one of them. So Reuben Durrett, I'd say, definitely suffered from depression, definitely suffered from a lot of tragedies in his life. He lost multiple children. The daughter that the couple sort of, held on so much hope, pinned so much hope on, passed away just after her coming out at 18. The mother, Reuben's wife, basically withdrew from society, refused to see anyone other than family from that point until her own death. So Reuben Durrett was essentially alone, and I think, lonely, depressed, and was reaching out to like-minded individuals who cared about history, in part to keep himself going. He poured himself into this organization, I think, in part to not let things sort of collapse around him. And that's a very human story. I think people might have shied away from that, a generation or so ago because, maybe that doesn't present him as manly, as, a strong individual, which he was. But I think it's a huge part of this story. It's a huge part of what makes him human. And I think one thing that we said about this book is there really is not a thesis. I'm not approaching this and saying, at the end, you will think the Filson is this, or you will think the Filson is that. What I hope I have accomplished is a real 360-degree look at this organization, these men and women, this city, this time. And by the end of it, you'll have seen it from every angle and can decide for yourself. But part of seeing it from every angle is, pulling back the curtain a little bit on some of these personalities and both the triumphs and the tragedies to make that story real.
I love this 360 vision, because that is really so much of what we gather from this. You've set that city context, right? This in 1884, we have the Southern Exposition happening right down there. And that really is this effort in a lot of ways, industrially or artistically, to put Louisville on a national map in this post-war moment. And this history activity, this research, this publishing, what limited archiving exists, the correspondence nationally, they see themselves in an emerging constellation of history institutions. Tell us what's happening on the national scene at this moment.
So, you're in basically the heart of the Gilded Age. We've come out of the Civil War. Louisville has emerged as, one of the powerhouses in the South. Probably its closest equivalent would be Richmond. And in fact, there are people in the history field who compare what's happening in Richmond with the Virginia Historical Society with the Filson. These are the two. These are the two to keep your eye on. You can forget about everyone else in the South. These are the two to keep your eye on. But what they're also doing is putting them on the same level as very established historical societies in the East, in New England, in New York, in Boston, and, in the Midwest, Chicago, Wisconsin. One of the fascinating things about Durrett is he corresponds with all of these other organizations. What are you doing? How do you do? How do you publish? What do you publish? How often do you meet? What kind of topics are you looking at? So, he is plugging himself and plugging the Filson into, I think you used a great word, constellation. He is giving the Filson the same status as some of these other stars around the country, in places like Philadelphia and Boston and other historical societies like Wisconsin and those in Chicago. And I sort of come back to that later in the book and make it clear that the Filson didn't get the credit it deserved. People remembered organizations that, were, working in places that they thought of history more directly. And the Filson sort of got lost and got forgotten. But Durrett never gave up on it and never wavered in that the work we were doing, and I do say we, it is our legacy, was on par with these other organizations and these other places. And I think Louisville was a unique opportunity to do that in terms of money, resources, education, finance, leisure time, all of these things coming together to create a historical society.
And you mentioned, Durrett making smart business decisions, right? That extended the longevity of this organization, sort of past the sort of 3 or 5 year range of a lot of its predecessors. Some of them didn't even last that long. Very soon we move beyond this sort of mythical 10 founders, that pantheon that we initially started from, and you saw some massive expansion, a thoughtful expansion of the membership. What did that look like? Who did it bring in?
Okay. And massive and thoughtful, I think, two really good adjectives. Let me ask this question. Talking about first 15 years of the Filson Club, as it was known then, how many assume during those 15 years it remained all male? Would you guess? How many would assume that it excluded Jewish members? Excluded Catholic members? Wrong on all counts. From the very beginning, when they expanded the membership beyond those 10 founders, women were part of the Filson from the very first incoming class. And by the last roll we have in this period, 1897, 25% of the organization's members were women. There were Jewish members. In fact, one of the most fascinating people in Louisville, if I had a time machine, this is who I would go back and meet, was Rabbi Moses, who was rabbi of one of the congregations. He not only was a member, he gave a paper, which I hope we'll come back to. Women gave papers. Even though this was an era of strong anti-Catholic sentiment in a lot of quarters, there were Catholic members, including the Archbishop of Louisville. So here you have a really interesting mix of people, and it's very easy, and not just it's easy, it's been coded into the mythology of the Filson that it was a gentleman's club. You know, I asked that question because I assumed it. I think a lot of us assumed it, that for a long time it was just, you know, a waspy organization. Now, there were still groups that weren't represented. You know, I think we pretty obviously African Americans, you know, in this Jim Crow environment, and we'll talk about that. Native Americans, you know, there were groups that were excluded, and there were groups where you know, there was really problematic things that happened. But this is what I mean by a 360 degree. On the other hand, you know, coming back to women members, you know, by today's standards, no. There was still a lot of work to be done. But Reuben Durrett, especially over and over again, surprised me by saying, you know, I'm throwing this topic out there. I want to make sure that there's a female perspective. We want to do a program on the Civil War. Let's have, or, you know, the Battle of Perryville. Let's have a Union side represented. Let's have a Confederate side represented. And if any women were in the area or near the battlefield, I want your story too. He goes to a DAR event and gives a kind of a keynote address, and makes a very impassioned plea that there needs to be more done for women's history, and not just famous women, but everyday women. Now, it's still couched in some problematic language, but, you know, it's surprising. And it's surprising that, you know, his relationship with Rabbi Moses was as strong as it was. It's surprising that, you know, the inroads into these Catholic communities were as strong as they were. So I think that it was a smart business decision. I think it was a thoughtful expansion, but in many ways it was surprising. And I think in that surprise, you unfold other surprises. It's like a gift that keeps giving, because when you start looking at, you know, what's the list of those presentations? What were the topics? Who were the presenters? And you see women presenting, and you see these Jewish members presenting, you know, it creates some really interesting stories. Which, you know, are all recorded.
Well, I want to circle back in and dive into a couple of those conversations. You know, obviously the Filson has just launched its African American History Initiative, and Dr. Jacqueline Hudson is the inaugural program manager. So thrilled to have her here. You say we learn quite a bit about the Filson and race, how it's obviously excluding Black members, but it's treating Black history in its topics and in its papers. What kind of representation is there? What do we learn?
So out of the 10 chapters, 2 chapters are dedicated to this question of how African American history was treated and dealt with. And I think that was important. I think it was important to address that. The primary way, the first of the 2 chapters deals with what are known as dialect stories. And dialect stories are essentially, best example is Uncle Remus, the Uncle Remus stories. You know, the idea of an idealized plantation existence told through a Black character that is given voice, that is given life, that is given animation by a white author. And surprisingly, for a history organization, or maybe not surprisingly, but for a history organization, the papers presented often veered into a variety of subgenres. There was poetry. There were memorials to past members. There were artworks presented. And on 5 occasions, there were dialect stories in these 15 years that I'm looking at. Five different occasions where some version of African-American history was presented, all through this lens of sort of a Moonlight and Magnolias version of antebellum life, or a very stereotypical, very harshly defined caricature of more recent times. And there's a point in the book where I very deliberately say, okay, 5 nights out of 15 years, 5 presentations out of dozens and dozens and dozens. You know, was this really such a big deal? You know, what are the stakes here? And I think that's a worthwhile question, because then it allows you to say, well, did they know better? Could things have been different? And it's very easy to say, oh, that's just the times. That's just the way it was. But I think one of the things I wanted to accomplish in that chapter was to say what the result of that was. What kind of history were they creating and shaping that flowed down for decades after these 5 presentations? And again, trying to give you a more rounded view of that. And I think my favorite example, one of the 5, and this idea of, well, you know, that's just the way it was. They didn't, you know, everyone was like that. You know, it was Louisville after all. I mean, come on, what do you expect? One of the 5 presentations was delivered to the Filson Club. It was actually one of the female presenters. It was actually the first female presenter. And it's a really kind of interesting topic when you stop and think about it. It was about an African-American woman who was a slave owner. These were rare, but there were people of color who did own slaves. And this Filson Club member had put together a piece of research based on Eliza Tevis, who was one of these slave owners. What was interesting, and I have to really credit Jenny Cole and our who works with our archives and our resources, for knowing that the Eliza Tevis file at the Filson had another copy of essentially the same presentation, but she had rewritten it for a Northern New England periodical. The difference between the two is night and day. The presentation to the Filson Club, Eliza Tevis, is very stereotyped. She's laughable. She's lazy. She's feckless. Her slaves are children that she mistreats. The story retold for a New England middle-class publication, she's a businesswoman. She turns this enterprise into running a school for domestic help and creating domestic help that becomes the creme de la creme for Louisville and the surrounding area. Her people that she trains, that she teaches to read and write, that she teaches accounting to, become the gold standard for domestic help in and around Louisville. Same woman, 2 different stories. And it says to me that this idea of, well, they didn't know any better. They definitely knew better. They definitely knew that the same story can be told different ways. The same history can be told different ways. So that's why I thought it was important to draw out these, even if they're just 5, to draw them out and to really put them under the microscope to see what they were doing. The 6th is the topic of its own chapter. And it was the night a presentation was given on the Ku Klux Klan. A very apologist, a very pro-Klan presentation. And this is another one that's been known to exist. This one was not hiding, you know, under a rock somewhere. This was actually in the minute books of the Filson. And it's been very thoughtfully ignored for 100 140 some or, 130 some years ever since. Obviously, why? It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that this was a program here. So how did I end up doing a whole chapter on this? It was one night, it was one presentation. There's only a couple sources. There's the Courier Journal article, and there's this piece in the Minutes book. And this is where it's one of my favorite approaches to history. We sometimes call it microhistory, where you take a really small event, a single night in Louisville, December night in Louisville, and you build out and you build out and you build out. And I think it became more and more interesting to see who was this presenter. She was a widow, widow of a Confederate general from Nashville. She had begun a speaking circuit. She ingratiated herself very much in Louisville. And the Filson was really a key part of her career after her husband had passed away. And that career was based on lecturing about the Klan. And so again, what are the stakes of that? What does that do? Again, if it's just one night, or is there a greater impact? And I want everyone to buy the books. I'm not going to give them too much away, but I think by the time you're done with that chapter, you get another sense of, wow, yes, that was just one night, and yes, this was the Jim Crow South, but there were impacts well beyond that evening, and there were impacts that we still need to think about today.
There are 3 pieces of evidence, because there is a flag, and that I'm going to leave you to go buy the book and see a picture of it and learn that story about how we put all of those pieces together. Thinking about, again, topics that perhaps more frequently come up than African American history, Indigenous history is omnipresent throughout the early Filson. I know this audience is a lot of regular Filson members, so that that over the past 3 years, Kelly Heiberger has been leading our efforts to engage with tribal nations whose ancestral lands are here in the Ohio Valley, to work to repatriate ancestral and sacred and ceremonial remains and objects. Plug for an upcoming program on November 19th. We're having a panel about tribal citizenship in the modern age, featuring some of those tribal nations and their representatives that we've been working with for the past 3 years. Absolutely be back here for that one. How is Indigenous history treated and mistreated in the early Filson?
So I knew I wanted to do a Native American history, Native Nations piece of this, a chapter at least. So I actually sat down with Kelly and said, what would you suggest? This is obviously a big topic, but what would you recommend I look at? And her answer was, look at this question of erasure, the idea of erasing Native history and Native American history and Native Nations history from the history of Kentucky. The idea that this was a unpopulated, happy hunting ground, ripe for the taking by pioneers because no one was here. That's the mythology. So start with that. And sure enough, that was really smart advice, because that was something that the Filson came back to over and over and over again. And Reuben Durrett comes out, bubbles up as one of the biggest proponents of this mythology. I mean, including some wacky stuff. I'm not gonna give any spoilers, but some of his theories were like really, really out there. And it's always been a little bit of a mystery to historians that have dealt with Durrett and dealt with the Filson. Why did he have this bee in his bonnet? Because it seemed to be more than just, well, that was the times. Everyone thought that way. And I'm particularly proud of this chapter. I mean, I'm going to speak lightly around it. The chapter really unfolds like a bit of a murder mystery, where we're trying to figure out why Durrett had this focus and why he was so almost maniacal about it. And bit by bit, it starts to unfold and the pieces start to fall together. And then there is a smoking gun article from the Courier Journal that makes it all clear why he cared, why this was so important to him. And once you have that, it all makes sense. And the concept of erasure of Native American history becomes much more obvious and much more complete and much, if not excusable, because it certainly isn't, understandable. You get what the purpose was. You get what is trying to be accomplished. So I'll leave it at that.
Everybody wants a murder mystery and so we've talked a lot about what these early activities of the Filson Club look like, their lectures, their publications that come out regularly, this sort of steady drumbeat of scholarship and being a participating part of this emerging academic historical landscape. How does the early Filson look to engage in different ways? So we've talked about fairs and expositions.
Yeah.
Where do we participate in those, and what do those do for this organization?
So this is where I think lots of surprises came out. On the cover, it says, this is the Filson Historical Society. This is a history of the Filson. It isn't. It is, but it isn't. This is really a history of Louisville. This is a history of Kentucky. This is a history of the historical profession. And it is through all of these tendrils that we get into things like expositions, not just the Southern Expo, which really gives rise to the Filson, but the Chicago World's Fair. The Kentucky building of the Chicago World's Fair was driven in large part by the Filson. The Daniel Boone statue we all know and love outside Cherokee Park, Filson. Enid Yandell is the originator of that idea. Another falsehood. Guess what I found? Someone preceded Enid, got to the idea first. It's in the book. Our park system, our beloved park system, Cherokee Park, Shawnee, Iroquois. Much of that starts with the Filson. DAR coming to Louisville or coming to Kentucky. Filson's there. So over and over and over again, all of these opportunities for the Filson to engage, not just in a paper, in a room, and a conversation afterwards, but getting out there, putting the public in what today we call public history, commemoration, creating sites, creating parks, creating monuments, creating opportunities for people to discuss and engage. The Filson was doing all of it. When the tornado hit in 1890, the first thing Reuben Durrett said is, let's get people to write down their memories right now. You know, that's very modern. Like there's organizations and museums today that will crow about how they're doing, rapid collecting. Reuben Durrett was doing it in 1890. It's a very modern way of looking at the role of a historical society. And I think there is a whole chapter about the parks and Louisville park system. And I think one thing that I found interesting was this idea of our parks being connected to these history-minded folks. And what were the intersections between creating public space and creating public parks? What was the connection between war memorials and historic sites and the Cherokee Park we know and love today? Even the names, Cherokee, Shawnee, Iroquois. Again, always been a little bit of a mystery. People have hoped to try to figure out where and why those came from. I would venture to say mystery solved. And it came from within the Filson. It came from with one of those original 10 founders. Oh, and if you've ever wanted ammunition for either side on the Castleman statue argument, it goes back to our guys. And I think you'll be very surprised what the original idea was and what that originally looked like. But it was all part of the Filson story. So over and over and over again, I think, and again, I hate to keep coming back to this metaphor of 360. I don't want to beat it to death, but on the one hand, we've talked about African American history and Native American history, and it's not great. As you read these chapters, I hope that you take away important stuff, but it's hard reading. I hope I've made it accessible. I hope I've made it readable, but it's not an easy topic. But on the other hand, you have these other flashes of brilliance and things that the Filson did that are legacies in a positive way today. And so you really, I think, come away thinking of this organization from all these different angles of both being, incredibly entrenched in some ways and incredibly progressive and thoughtful and exciting in other ways. Just like real people.
And this era that you treat here, sort of up to the turn of the 20th century, what brings it to a close? This thing could have fallen apart.
Yeah, and nearly did. Well, first of all, I took it up to 1899, which is a little weird because Reuben Durrett lives until 1913. So why didn't I write it till to that point? And honestly, it was again a little piece of evidence I found describing the Filson event, the Filson Club meeting on New Year's Eve night, the night between 1899 and 1900. And they didn't deliver a paper. They didn't do their traditional format. They sat around and they drank their cider and they talked about whether it was really a new century or not. Was that the night of the new century, or was the new century going to be next year? And it just struck me as such a metaphor, because this is such a Gilded Age organization. It is such a 1800s organization, right down to this room where they're meeting. There's a better picture of the library itself. It is just chock-a-block full of stuff. It is just, a perfect Gilded Age space. And by the beginning of the 20th century, organizations like this and quote, amateur historians like Reuben Durrett are falling out of favor. History departments are getting created at all these land-grant colleges. The progressive era is roaring to life. Interestingly enough, Reuben Durrett helps kickstart this by providing research for one of the historians that really sort of blows the doors off of old history and introduces new history, one that leaves people like Durrett behind. And so this night of 1899, which is where the book ends, really becomes this sort of poignant metaphor. Yes, Reuben Durrett lives on for another few years, but by then what he's doing is on our autopilot. The founding era of those first 15 years had cemented everything. And then yes, Durrett dies, and then something no one had ever talked about, the vice president that they'd had created, had sort of elevated, knowing that Durrett was always complaining about his health, dies within a few weeks, the two of them. So this organization really, really could have fallen apart. And there's just really kind of just an allusion to what happens, with sort of stumbling through a few years, and then it is another force of personality. It is a single individual who sort of takes the helm and ushers in the next era, the new era. In many ways, a parallel, a mirror to Reuben Durrett, but in very different circumstances and very different guises, including, I think we're figuring out, this sort of openness that the Filson had in his first 15 years maybe disappeared. Maybe that's why we have this mythology of it being a very closed organization, is people forgot about those original 15 years into the original openness of having a more diverse membership, at least in some ways.
This is going to be my last question before we throw it to you all, but I love this picture that you paint of that New Year's Eve night. And you can really get the texture of that from looking at these photos and reading some of the back and forth about some of these evenings that happen. You get to be a fly on the wall at a Filson Club meeting during this era. What night are you choosing?
Well, I said I wanted to come back to it, so this is the perfect opportunity. So Rabbi Moses, I mentioned, was one of the presenters. He gave a paper, and there's a many pages devoted to this story. It's a great story, great archival pieces that we're able to put together. But essentially, he is giving a paper to a Louisville audience, a Southern audience, arguing that race is a cultural construction, that our ideas of race, our ideas of a Jewish race, an Aryan race, these are all cultural constructions. He calls them collages, you know. And he's giving this argument to a room full of people that, you know, have come out of the Civil War, half have fought for the Confederacy, all are living in Jim Crow culture. And he's essentially saying, yeah, there's no such thing as race except in our heads. It's fireworks. And sure enough, this was not a particularly well-received paper. And the fireworks begin almost immediately. And there's back and forth. But there is back and forth. It's a dialogue. It's a conversation. It's a heated one. And there's other nights where the focus turns on gender. And it gets heated, and the Courier Journal reporter even notes that the women were hissing at the men. These were heated debates and heated conversations, but they were happening. And to me, that's what's so interesting. So if I had to pick one, I would have loved to have been a fly on that wall that night when Rabbi Moses gave his paper, because wow, it was a brave paper to deliver, and I would have loved to meet him anyway, but I would love to have shaken his hand that night.
I mean, talk about, the Filson being at the forefront of these professional developments, but interpretively, that is a public presentation that would be contested still today. Let's be honest. That really is just an incredible evening. All right, we will throw open to audience questions. Yeah, David.
Okay,
Wait
I'm
for the mic.
bringing the
Yeah.
microphone around, and please put it right up to your mouth so everyone can hear. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an absolutely fantastic presentation, and I picked out the Christmas presents for all my grandchildren now. You've left us hanging a little bit, so unless we need to wait for the sequel, can you identify the ultimate successor to Reuben Durrett?
You'll remember all of his names better than
Rogers, Clark, Ballard, Thruston.
Yes.
The order is important. He was very particular about that.
Yes, but another man who became identified with. He also happened to be president of SAR as well. So a lot of folks in Louisville know that name, probably better than they know Reuben Durrett.
If anyone came to the Parks exhibit that we had open earlier in the year, he was the tiny figure in buckskins dressed as George Rogers Clark along the back wall. He is absolutely fascinating. We have all of his papers, which are voluminous, not only his personal papers, but his Filson administrative papers, and then a lot of his research notes from all of his various esoteric topics of interest. And they are an absolutely rich source that we have not even begun to tap. So that book is forthcoming, but don't ask us when.
I have three questions. I'll make them quick. The first one would be, where is the library that in which they met? Is it still extant and that? The second question, I think I've forgotten. The third question is, were any of these presentations made on music? I mean, we're going to get the book and I'll find out about that soon, but a simple answer. And then the other, I've forgotten it again. Oh, yeah. Were these presentations as today, as here in this room, were they open to the public ever, or was this just members of the club at the time, now society?
Okay, so the library question, the library was within Durrett's home, so it was his private library. The house is no longer extant, nor is the library. The library got sold to the University of Chicago, and literally Durrett's last months. There is a presentation on music, and I actually put a plug in the book that this is a huge resource. Another female presenter did the history of music in Kentucky. And the thing is this thick. I mean, she did choir, she did folk music, she did, any type of music you could think of. She documented it and is in this volume. It's one of the presentations that does still exist and is a fantastic resource that I think has gone largely untapped. And the third question was, public meetings. So it was a membership-only organization. Members were invited, but it was loose. You could bring friends under the auspices of they might be invited to become Filson members as well. But it was invitation only during this era. You had to be invited to become a Filson member. You couldn't ask to become, or you could, but it wasn't going to be guaranteed. But it was open to friends of, colleagues of, as well.
You sort of touched on one of what I was going to ask. When researching my ancestor, I learned that he had written a letter to Governor Shelby about an event in Jessamine County. And so I first came here looking for it. I went to Frankfurt. Well, I found out that it was at the University of Chicago. And I found out that Durrett sold that collection, so I now have a copy of it. But I was wondering, do we know why he did that?
So it is talked about in the book, and it's a sad chat. I've already mentioned that he's had depression issues during these 15 years that are pretty obvious to see kind of reading between the lines. It got especially worse towards the end. He always complained about his health. He lived until 1913, but he always complained about his health. His health was getting worse and worse as it went along. His family needed the money. But I think more than all of those answers, he was incredibly frustrated. He had tried to get a permanent building up and running for the Filson outside, it was always his home. It hadn't been successful. He had petitioned for federal buildings that were being decommissioned to be donated and never worked out. He'd been stymied over and over again. He'd always had swing for the fences, amazing ideas that never could get funding. And I think by the time it was over, he was like, Kentucky doesn't care about its history. University of Chicago does. And there's a really poignant letter after this sale where a Louisvillian and Kentuckian goes to his alma mater at the University of Chicago and says how bittersweet it is that Kentucky has lost this, that Louisville has lost this, but it's now part of this other institution. So, kind of a sad story. Yeah.
Many years ago, when I married my husband, I joined the Christ Church Cathedral downtown, and there was a lady there who was a member named Roland Durrett. Her sister was all there, but I don't remember her name. And fascinating lady. And I was always told she was related to Reuben Durrett. Was she a daughter, a granddaughter?
So only one of the Durrett's children survived. It was a son. He became a doctor. He was the one that essentially took the money from the sale. Reuben Durrett passed away shortly after. I know he was, I'm sure that they had children. I can't remember how many, but if it was a direct line to Reuben Durrett, that would have been the only, because he was the only one that survived. They lost, I think, 4 other children. And then one of one of Durrett's grandsons, one of also passed away. So again, just this cloud, this darkness of grief over this home, I think drives a lot of what Reuben Durrett's doing outside the home.
This question is from our virtual audience, Barbara. Could you talk a little bit about the Filson's name and John Filson?
Sure. So when these 10 men come together, to name the organization, they pick the Filson Club. Who's Filson? None of their names were Filson. I've been talking about Durrett. So Filson is often considered, especially by these gentlemen, certainly considered the first historian of Kentucky. And his maps become famous, his work on Kentucky history, which of course is very pioneer focused, very, white male focused, very, sort of triumphalist. But they all admire him, not surprisingly. And so they decide to take the name of the Filson Club as their homage to this first historian of Kentucky. But it's also a nod to what they're attempting. They're attempting to capture the history of Kentucky, the history of Louisville, the history of the region. And today we refer to it as the history of the Ohio River Valley, which is pretty much what they said too.
My question is, would you name the other people that were involved in establishing the Filson Society besides Reuben Durrett?
All right. I have to cheat, but I know right where it is. All right. Reuben Durrett, Thomas Speed, Basil Duke, John Mason Brown, Tom Bullitt, Richard Collins, James Purtle, George Davy, Alex Humphrey, and William Chenault. Those were the 10. Yeah. Or as I say in the next sentence, these are the 10 men who joined together in May 1884 to form the Filson Club. It was not an especially diverse bunch.
I'll ask this question that may be related. First of all, what was the intent of, let's say, historians versus lay versus the Kentucky Historical Society in establishing the Filson Club?
So the Kentucky Historical Society is one of those organizations that is mentioned in that first chapter. It's one that, unfortunately, at the time had more gone than come. It had been established many years prior, had gone into hibernation, had come back, had gone into hibernation. And in fact, the opening of chapter 1 begins with one of those men I mentioned, Richard Collins, talking about how the Kentucky Historical Society is never going to amount to anything. We need another historical society. So fortunately, that history, they sort of came back from that lull and are another great organization today. But they are part of that churn. They are part, and again, some of these 10 founders had experience with that churn and that sort of downturn headed into creating this organization.
And if you're willing to make a drive this winter, in Frankfurt, they've got a local history lecture series. Dan is going to be talking about this book in December. And then I'm going to be following up in January with a talk that carries that into the next generation and compares the state establishment of the Kentucky Historical Society, which is when it becomes permanent and keeps going, with these further developments of the second generation of the Filsons. So there's maybe a preview of that next chapter.
So Dan has left us with several cliffhangers. His book is going to be available for sale, so you can find out more information. But please join me in thanking Dan and Patrick.
Thank you.